So another 3 months has passed and Roger Martin-Fagg has published his latest quarterly economic update, which those of you who are regular readers or viewer of this summary will know is a mixture of a bit of history, a bit of commentary on the current situation with a bit of economic theory mixed in, and some forecasts. And this one being the last one of 2021, we're now looking ahead to Roger's forecasts for all of 2022. So he starts out with a bit of a summary on government spending, a bit of commentary of where we are. And he talks about the fact that whilst spending, generally speaking, isn't always a good thing, it is if it's in investment. And government investment is important for all sorts of things to provide the infrastructure to drive productivity and growth in economies. He notes that the UK, the USA, Germany and India have all been quite bad at government investment over recent years, in contrast with countries like Singapore, China, the UAE and Sweden. But he notes that in 2019, the UK government committed to spend 100 billion a year over the next 5 years to increase the productivity and part of the sort of levelling up agenda in the UK. But then, of course, COVID hit and everything changed, and spending instead focused on things like vaccine development and all sorts of schemes to preserve capacity in the economy, like furlough and so on. And around the world, that's injected an extra 19 trillion US dollars into the system. And there's no way that the world can increase output to mop up that extra cash, so it will lead to inflation. And the idea is that inflation will be around until purchasing power is restored, having had the buying power of our currency eroded by that inflation. So for at least another 2 years, he predicts. He also notes that in the UK, there has been, first in a little while, a tax increase announced, which takes place next April. We'll be going on to our national insurance bills. It amounts to about £13 billion, but he notes this isn't really extra money in the system. It's more of a redistribution from the healthy to the unhealthy. And anyway, in comparison to 300 billion extra pounds in the UK economy, it's not likely to have much of an impact. So we still have this 300 billion, which is excess in the system. That's what's going to drive the inflation. But he notes that it's probably not likely to lead to a recession. So if we look at his first graph of this report, I think the two main things that come out of here that are interesting. One is the gap up here between receipts and spending, nearly 400 billion, which we've referred to just now, and we'll come back to. And the other one, for those of us that don't study these sort of data very often, is just to remind ourselves of where generally the UK government's money comes from. And it's interesting when you ask people how much they think is from, let's say, income tax. That's about 43% of the total. And that and VAT combined brings it to about 60%. Something like corporation tax is only, depending on your expectations, only about 5%. The next graph that he shows is interesting. He's drawing our attention here to all of these missing people. Between 15 and 24, we're missing about 1.2 million 15 to 19-year-olds and 600,000 20 to 24-year-olds. And combine that with the 1.3 million EU citizens that have left the UK, who were largely in those age groups as well. That's what's driving this shortage of labour that we're seeing at the moment as well. Now, effectively, we're at full employment in the UK, which economists regard to be about 5%. So that's therefore going to drive up wages. And if those wages go up faster than productivity goes up, which it is definitely doing, then that's going to be another driver for inflation. Just before I move on from this one, though, he does pull out 2 or 3 other observations, consequences of this graph. One is that with this dip in this age group, it means that demand for family homes will reduce from about 2028, he predicts, which is quite interesting as these people start families. He also talks about the fact that there's going to be a couple of transfers going on. One is a transfer from the private sector to the public sector, the other way around, sorry, the public sector to the private sector. And that's mainly because there's a wage cap on the public sector, whereas wages are going to have to increase in the private sector. So where there are shortages, for example, for HGV drivers, then workers will leave their public sector jobs and move to private sector jobs. And that's already been seen in the headlines in the last few days around refuse collection, and may well impact things like road gritting and so on over the winter. And the other transfer that he talks about is where wages are going up now, there are going to be fewer people on universal credit. So it's transferring the burden of the propping up the low wages from the government to employers. So both of those are a couple of interesting extra sides as well. He goes on to talk about money supply. Here we have the supply compared to lending, which generally speaking runs at about 100 billion a year, which is funded by borrowing. But here you can see the huge spike brought about through the COVID pandemic. That's totaling 400 billion. So quite a lot of extra cash in the system there. And as Roger told us earlier in the year, any extra money supply has to be mopped up between growth or inflation. So it's the sum of the two. So if we can't grow at something like the low teens of percentage increase that we're seeing in the money supply at the moment, then that will come out in inflation. So yet another driver inflation as well. It's just where the inflation mops up all that extra money in the system. It talks about productivity. And here's an interesting graph that shows that actually in the UK, productivity growth increased at about 2% a year up until about the financial crash. And then something seemed to reset it. And since then, we've only been growing at about 0.6%. Now, we're often told that UK productivity is lower than in France, for example, but actually total productivity is about the same. That's the productivity from both labour and invested capital at the same time. But the labour one is much lower. So in the UK, the output per worked hour is about 15% lower than in France. And the theory goes that if you have higher minimum wages, then that encourages employers to invest more and get higher automation, which increases the productivity. But Roger has another theory, that of the long tail of SME companies in the UK, which he calls mostly lifestyle businesses, which is inefficiently using labour. And he predicts that several of these will be going out of business as we recover and everything is stretched in the high growth phase after the recession that we just had. And that will then release that labour for the use by others. But he also talks about the fact that in the UK, we have been generally reluctant to invest as a combination of the 2008 crash, the Brexit vote bringing uncertainty, and now COVID as well. So he doesn't have too much of a positive view, generally speaking, on the outlook for productivity growth. If we go on then to the future, we talks about now the next 18 months or so, basically interest rates you think will go up, but not as much as they should. He feels that governments will tolerate a higher level of inflation for a while because it's inevitable. So we just think that interest rates will go up to maybe 1% or so, but no higher for now, maybe longer run up to 1.8. But he does say that any stagflation or recession is probably quite unlikely. And anyway, the tax receipts will increase as the recovery continues. He talks about there being winners and losers in here as well. He talks about the fact that the bottom 20% of the population will suffer because their universal credit, £20 is disappearing, and food and energy prices are going up by 10 and 30% respectively. In the private sector, above that, for the top 80%, wages will probably increase to match inflation. In the public sector, less so. But with £180 billion excess in household accounts at the moment, then everyone will carry on spending and growth will continue to the point where we'll reach pre-COVID levels within the sort of next 6 months or so. If we just look ahead then to those figures he's given us for next year, he's saying wages will probably be going up by about 6%, interest rates 1%, as we've said, exchange rates about where they are now, pound just slightly below current prices and oil price slightly above. And a little tour of the rest of the world. This is an interesting graph from the US. If we thought that our 300 billion extra cash in the system was a lot, here's the US, 4 or 5 times the size of our country, but $4 trillion of extra cash flooding through. And that's really driven up demand hugely. And that's what's pushing the drive for imports and consumption of electricity and consumables around the world. So that's what's driving a lot of the shortages and the extra costs in shipping and inflation in commodity prices and so on. Around the EU, he confesses that the EU have recovered quicker than anyone expected. He also notes in there that if you look at online purchases, then the EU average is about 15% of total spending, where in the UK it's about 30%. So that's quite interesting. In China, that's been growing about 9% based on energy use is the figure that he uses, but he predicts that to be slowing down, mainly because there's a lot of electricity rationing going on in China at the moment. And just finally, around a global summary, prices are still having to increase to mop up this $19 trillion that we've talked about. But he talks about as well about private equity having another $2.5 trillion sloshing around looking for a home. And that's currently paying about 45% over market prices for any deals that are going around. So if you're in the market looking at M&A activity, you'll be seeing that that's very frothy at the moment, and UK buyouts are running about 60% ahead of the level that it was back in 2019. So in conclusion, inflation is going to persist. Growth will continue for a while and reach pre-COVID levels very soon. Business failures will increase as the economy recovers, usually because fast-growing companies tend to get tempted into overtrading. And he closes with an observation that the government strategy is clearly to allow wages to increase, in turn to let productivity gradually increase, to invest the 100 billion infrastructure, and then to blame business for anything that goes wrong. So that's the summary of Roger's report for October 21. Let's tune in earlier next year to see his report of how he did on his forecasts this year, and good luck with all your businesses.